everyone. Well, folks, it's happening. Nasara Gisara seems to be truly rolling out in the open. We're seeing all kinds of amazing news pop up all over the place. Talk of abolishing the IRS in our legislature. All sorts of things are going on that can only point to one thing if you have read the Nasara Act itself and the bullet points that go along with it. So I'm extraordinarily excited. You know, after you study these things enough, you realize that the currency revaluation, commonly called the RV or the GCR, can only be one thing, a part of Nasara Gisara. The history is all there right in front of us. I'm not going to do a deep dive on that. I'm simply coming back in to pick up where we left off and start reading our book again on chapter 10 today or this evening. But I am excited. I'm super excited about what we see happening in world events, not just here in the United States, but worldwide. People in Iraq must be getting excited at this point to see what's happening with their currency. And my gosh, there's just so much happening every day. I will list some of my favorites that I like to listen to when that they share the news and they talk about it, where if you wanted to get more information on this, if you haven't already found your sources or you're just starting to comprehend what's going on. Some of those are the original Mark Z. Dr. Kia Pruitt is fabulous. Dr. Scott Young is another really great one. Mel Carmine is fun with XRP QFS. And we even see and hear Robert Kiyosaki talking about this. There are so many others that I can't even begin to name them all. So I'm not even going to try. Those are just the ones that come to mind right off the bat that I have found. So if you're not already up to speed on that, I do encourage you to seek that information out. It does impact all of us, and it's very positive. Don't let the negative people out there get in your head to try to tell you that's not true. None of it's happening. The history is there. The events are real, and we're seeing it all happen right in front of us. So, of course, that's another reason that I initially named this series of reading our book, The Power of the Powerless. It's all happening right in front of us. We are all part of the movie because it is all happening in front of us right now. So with that said, there was one observation I wanted to call out before I start reading the book. In the last episode, part 3, as I was reading, I noticed something really interesting. It was talking about how the negative people in the situation back then would call out the positive people who were trying to speak truth and essentially try to bring them down to the level of the negative people who are trying to manipulate the population for their own motives and their own gain, which it seems we're seeing a lot of that now, in my opinion. They would call those speaking truth on the positive side that were for the larger populace. They would call them out and say they were simply just trying to inflate their egos and be the center of attention, which is just a lot what the negative folks seem to do. So they just project, in other words. So my observation, while it is simple, I'm not sure that it's super obvious to everyone. And that's why I found it interesting that it called it out in the book, that they would call those people out back then. And now it seems so clear why we have a group such as the 17th letter and our Anons, who are two different parts of what's happening. And like what our media likes to say, the mainstream media, likes to lump them together. But they are two different aspects of that, but they're anonymous. And my gosh, doesn't that take that ability away? So that the negative aspect of this battle is unable to point fingers at someone speaking truth on the positive side. When they're anonymous, they can no longer point fingers at a specific individual and say that they're just speaking up to inflate their ego and, project on them what the negative is doing itself. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. I thought it was just interesting to hear that called out in the book, and how smart that was, that we have people today with the social media tools that we have out there speaking truth, and they really didn't have a big ego, so they chose to speak up anonymously to take that away, because they didn't care either. I'm sure that's a big part of it. But I won't belabor the point. I think it was made. And I will begin with chapter 10, reading our book, The Power of the Powerless. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 10. Undeniably, the most important political event in Czechoslovakia after the advent of the Husak leadership in 1969 was the appearance of Charter 77. The spiritual and intellectual climate surrounding its appearance, however, was not the product of any immediate political event. That climate was created by the trial of some young musicians associated with a rock group called the Plastic People of the Universe. Their trial was not a confrontation of two differing political forces or conceptions, but two different conceptions of life. On the one hand, there was the sterile puritanism of the post-totalitarian establishment, and, on the other hand, unknown young people who wanted no more than to be able to live within the truth, to play the music they enjoyed, to sing songs that were relevant to their lives, and to live freely in dignity and partnership. These people had no past history of political activity. They were not highly motivated members of the opposition with political ambitions, nor were they former politicians expelled from the power structures. They had been given every opportunity to adapt to the status quo, to accept the principles of living within a lie, and thus to enjoy life undisturbed by the authorities. Yet they decided on a different course. Despite this, or perhaps precisely because of it, their case had a very special impact on everyone who had not yet given up hope. Moreover, when the trial took place, a new mood had begun to surface after the years of waiting, of apathy and of skepticism toward various forms of resistance. People were tired of being tired. They were fed up with stagnation, the inactivity, barely hanging on in the hope that things might improve after all. In some ways, the trial was the final straw. Many groups of differing tendencies, which until then had remained isolated from each other, reluctant to cooperate, or which were committed to forms of action that made cooperation difficult, were suddenly struck with the powerful realization that freedom is indivisible. Everyone understood that an attack on the Czech musical underground was an attack on a most elementary and important thing, something that in fact bound everyone together. It was an attack on the very notion of living within the truth, on the real aims of life. The freedom to play rock music was understood as a human freedom, and thus as essentially the same as the freedom to engage in philosophical and political reflection, the freedom to write, the freedom to express and defend the various social and political interests of society. People were inspired to feel a genuine sense of solidarity with the young musicians, and they came to realize that not standing up for the freedom of others regardless of how remote their means of creativity or their attitude to life, meant surrendering one's own freedom. There is no freedom without equality before the law, and there is no equality before the law without freedom. Charter 77 has given this ancient notion a new and characteristic dimension, which has immensely important implications for modern Czech history. What Slobásek, the author of the book 68, in a brilliant analysis calls the principle of exclusion, lies at the root of all our present-day morale and political misery. The principle was born at the end of the Second World War in that strange collusion of Democrats and communists, and was subsequently developed further and further, right to the bitter end. For the first time in decades, this principle has been overcome by Charter 77. All those united in the Charter have, for the first time, become equal partners. Charter 77 is not merely a coalition of communists and non-communists. That would be nothing historically new, and from the moral and political point of view, nothing revolutionary. But it is a community that is a priori open to anyone, and one in it is a priori assigned an inferior position. This was the climate, then, in which Charter 77 was created. Who could have foreseen that the prosecution of one or two obscure rock groups would have such far-reaching consequences? I think that the origins of Charter 77 illustrate very well what I've already suggested above, that in a post-totalitarian system, the real background to the movements that gradually assume political significance do not usually consist of overly political events or confrontations between different forces or concepts that are openly political. These movements, for the most part, originate elsewhere, in the far broader area of the pre-political, where living within a lie confronts living within the truth. That is, where the demands of the post-totalitarian system conflict with the real aims of life. These real aims can naturally assume a great many forms. Sometimes they appear as the basic material or social interests of a group or an individual, or at other times they may appear as certain intellectual and spiritual interests. At still other times, they may be the most fundamental of existential demands, such as the simple longing of people to live their own lives in dignity. Such a conflict acquires a political character, then, not because of the elementary political nature of the aims demanding to be heard, but simply because, given the complex system of manipulation on which the post-totalitarian system is founded and on which it is also dependent, every free human act or expression, every attempt to live within the truth, must necessarily appear as a threat to the system and, thus, as something which is political par excellence. Any eventual political articulation of the movements that grow out of this pre-political hinterland is secondary. It develops and matures as a result of the subsequent confrontation with the system, and not because it started off as a political program, project, or impulse. Once again, the events of 1968 confirm this. The communist politicians who were trying to reform the system came forward with their program, not because they had suddenly experienced a mystical enlightenment, but because they were led to do so by continued and increasing pressure from areas of life that had nothing to do with politics in the traditional sense of the word. In fact, they were trying in political ways to solve the social conflicts, which in fact were confrontations between the aims of the system and the aims of life, that almost every level of society had been experiencing daily and had been thinking about with increasing openness for years. Backed by this living resonance throughout society, scholars and artists had defined the problem in a wide variety of ways, and students were demanding solutions. The genesis of Charter 77 also illustrates the special political significance of the moral aspect of things that I have mentioned. Charter 77 would have been unimaginable without that powerful sense of solidarity among widely offering groups, and without the sudden realization that it was impossible to go on waiting any longer, and that the truth had to be spoken loudly and collectively, regardless of the virtual certainty of sanctions and the uncertainty of any tangible results in the immediate future. There are some things worth suffering for, Jan Patoka wrote shortly before his death. I think that Chartists understand this not only as Patoka's legacy, but also as the best explanation of why they do what they do. Seen from the outside, and chiefly from the vantage point of the system and its power structure, Charter 77 came as a surprise, as a bolt out of the blue. It was not a bolt out of the blue, of course, but that impression is understandable, since the ferment that led to it took place in the hidden sphere, in that semi-darkness where things are difficult to chart or analyze. The chances of predicting the appearance of the charter were just as slight as the chances are now of predicting where it will lead. Once again, it was that shock, so typical of moments when something from the hidden sphere suddenly bursts through the moribund surface of living within a lie. The more one is trapped in the world of appearances, the more surprising it is when something like that happens. Chapter 11. In societies under the post-totalitarian system, all political life in the traditional sense has been eliminated. People have no opportunity to express themselves politically in public, let alone to organize politically. The gap that results is filled by ideological ritual. In such a situation, people's interests in political matters naturally dwindles, and independent political thought, insofar as it exists at all, is seen by the majority as unrealistic, far-fetched, a kind of self-indulgent game, hopelessly distant from their everyday concerns, something admirable, perhaps, but quite pointless, because it is on the one hand entirely utopian, and on the other hand extraordinarily dangerous, in the view of the unusual vigor with which any move in that direction is persecuted by the regime. Yet even in such societies, individuals and groups of people exist who do not abandon politics as a vocation, and who, in one way or another, strive to think independently, to express themselves, in some cases, even to organize politically, because that is a part of their attempt to live within the truth. The fact that these people exist and work is in itself immensely important and worthwhile. Even in the worst of times, they maintain the continuity of political thought. If some genuine political impulse emerges from this or that pre-political confrontation and is properly articulated early enough, thus increasing its chances of relative success, then this is frequently due to these isolated generals without any army, who, because they have maintained the continuity of political thought in the face of enormous difficulties, can, at the right moment, enrich the new impulse with the fruits of their own political thinking. Once again, there is ample evidence for this process in Czechoslovakia. Almost all those who were political prisoners in the early 1970s, who had apparently been made to suffer in vain because of their quixotic efforts to work politically among an utterly pathetic and demoralized society, belong today, inevitably, among the most active Chartists. In Charter 77, the moral legacy of their earlier sacrifices is valued, and they have enriched this movement with their experience and that element of political thinking. And yet it seems to me that the thought and activity of those friends who have never given up direct political work and who are always ready to assume direct political responsibility very often suffer from one chronic fault: an insufficient understanding of the historical uniqueness of the post-totalitarian system as a social and political reality. They have little understanding of the specific nature of power that is typical for this system, and therefore they overestimate the importance of direct political work in the traditional sense. Moreover, they fail to appreciate the political significance of those pre-political events and processes that provide the living humus from which genuine political change usually springs. As political actors, or rather as people with political ambitions, they frequently try to pick up where natural political life left off. They maintain models of behavior that have been appropriate in more normal political circumstances, and thus, without really being aware of it, they bring an outmoded way of thinking, old habits, conceptions, categories, and notions to bear on circumstances that are quite new and radically different, without first giving adequate thought to the meaning and substance of such things in the new circumstances, to what politics as such means now, to what sort of thing can have political impact and potential, and in what way. Because such people have been excluded from the structures of power and are no longer able to influence those structures directly, and because they remain faithful to traditional notions of politics established in more or less democratic societies or in classical dictatorships, they frequently, in a sense, lose touch with reality. Why make compromises with reality, they say, when none of our proposals will ever be accepted anyway? Thus, they find themselves in a world of genuinely utopian thinking. As I have already tried to indicate, however, genuinely far-reaching political events do not emerge from the same sources and in the same way in the post-totalitarian system as they do in a democracy. And if a large portion of the public is indifferent to, even skeptical of, alternative political models and programs and the private establishment of opposition political parties, this is not merely because there is a general feeling of apathy towards public affairs and a loss of that sense of higher responsibility. In other words, it is not just a consequence of the general demoralization. There is also a bit of healthy social instinct at work in this attitude. It is as if people sensed intuitively that nothing is what it seems any longer, as the saying goes, and that from now on, therefore, things must be done entirely differently as well. If some of the most important political impulses in Soviet bloc countries in recent years have come initially, that is, before being felt on the level of actual power, from mathematicians, philosophers, physicians, writers, historians, ordinary workers, and so on, more frequently than from politicians, and if the driving force behind the various dissident movements come from so many people in non-political professions, this is not because these people are more clever than those who see themselves primarily as politicians. It is because those who are not politicians are also not bound by traditional political thinking and political habits, and therefore, paradoxically, they are more aware of genuine political reality and more sensitive to what can and should be done under the circumstances. There is no way around it. No matter how beautiful an alternative political model may be, it can no longer speak to the hidden sphere, inspire people in society, call for real political ferment. The real sphere of potential politics in the post-totalitarian system is elsewhere, in the continuing and cruel tension between the complex demands of that system and the aims of life, that is, the elementary need of human beings to live, to a certain extent at least, in harmony with themselves, that is, to live in a bearable way, not to be humiliated by their superiors and officials, not to be continually watched by the police, to be able to express themselves freely, to find an outlet for their creativity, to enjoy legal security, and so on. Anything that touches this field concretely, anything that relates to this fundamental, omnipresent, and living tension will inevitably speak to people. Abstract projects for an ideal political or economic order do not interest them to anything like the same extent, and rightly so, not only because everyone knows how little chance they have of succeeding, but also because today people feel that the less political policies are derived from a concrete and human here and now, and the more they fix their sights on an abstract someday, the more easily they can degenerate into new forms of human enslavement. People who live in the post-totalitarian system know only too well that the question of whether one or several political parties are in power and how these parties define and label themselves is of far less importance than the question of whether or not it is possible to live like a human being. To shed the burden of traditional political categories and habits and open oneself up fully to the world of human existence, and then to draw political conclusions only after having analyzed it. This is not only politically more realistic, but at the same time, from the point of view of an ideal state of affairs, politically more promising as well. A genuine, profound, and lasting change for the better, as I shall attempt to show elsewhere, can no longer result from the victory, were such a victory possible, of any particular traditional political conception, which can ultimately be only external, that is, a structural or systematic conception. More than ever before, such a change will have to derive from human existence, from the fundamental reconstitution of the position of people in the world, their relationships to themselves and to each other and to the universe. If a better economic and political model is to be created, then perhaps more than ever before it must derive from profound existential and more moral changes in society. This is not something that can be designed and introduced like a new car. If it is to be more than just a new variation on the old degeneration, it must, above all, be an expression of life in the process of transforming itself. A better system will not automatically ensure a better life. In fact, the opposite is true. Only by creating a better life can a better system be developed. Once more, I repeat that I am not underestimating the importance of political thought and conceptual political work. On the contrary, I think that genuine political thought and genuinely political work is precisely what we continually fail to achieve. If I say genuine, however, I have in mind the kind of thought and conceptual work that has freed itself of all the traditional political schemata that have been imported into our circumstances from a world that will never return, and whose return, even were it possible, would provide no permanent solution to the most important problems. The Second and Fourth Internationals, like many other political powers and organizations, may naturally provide significant political support for various efforts of ours, but neither of them can solve our problems for us. They operate in a different world and are a product of different circumstances. Their theoretical concepts can be interesting and instructive to us, but one thing is certain. We cannot solve our problems simply by identifying with these organizations. And the attempt in our country to place what we do in the context of some of the discussions that dominate political life in democratic societies often seems like sheer folly. For example, is it possible to talk seriously about whether we want to change the system or merely reform it? In the circumstances under which we live, This is a pseudo problem, since for the time being, there is simply no way we can accomplish either goal. We are not even clear about where reform ends and change begins. We know from a number of harsh experiences that neither reform nor change is in itself a guarantee of anything. We know that ultimately it is all the same to us whether or not the system in which we live, in the light of a particular doctrine, appears changed or reformed. Our concern is whether we can live with dignity in such a system, whether it serves people rather than people serving it. We are struggling to achieve this with the means available to us and the means it makes sense to employ. Western journalists, submerged in the political banalities in which they live, may label our approach as overly legalistic, as too risky, revisionist, counter-revolutionary, bourgeois, communist, or as too right-wing or left-wing. But this is the very last thing that interests us. Chapter 12. One concept that is a constant source of confusion, chiefly because it has been imported into our circumstances from circumstances that are entirely different, is the concept of an opposition. What exactly is an opposition in the post-totalitarian system? In democratic societies with a traditional parliamentary system of government, political opposition is understood as a political force on the level of actual power, most frequently a party or coalition of parties, which is not a part of the government. It offers an alternative political program. It has ambitions to govern, and it is recognized and respected by the government in power as a natural element in the political life of the country. It seeks to spread its influence by political means and competes for power on the basis of agreed upon legal regulations. In addition to this form of opposition, there exists the phenomenon of the extra-parliamentary opposition, which again consists of forces organized more or less on the level of actual power, but which operate outside the rules created by the system, and which employ different means that are usual within the framework. In classical dictatorships, the term opposition is understood to mean the political forces which have also come out with an alternative political program. They operate either legally or on the outer limits of legality, but in any case, they cannot compete for power within the limits of some agreed upon regulations, or the term opposition may be applied to forces preparing for a violent confrontation with the ruling power, or who feel themselves to be in this state of confrontation already, such as various guerrilla groups or liberation movements. An opposition in the post-totalitarian system does not exist in any of these senses. In what way, then, can the term be used? 1. Occasionally, the term opposition is applied, mainly by Western journalists, to persons or groups inside the power structure who find themselves in a state of hidden conflict with the highest authorities. The reason for this conflict may be certain differences, not very sharp differences naturally, of a conceptual nature, but more frequently it is quite simply a longing for power or a personal antipathy to others who represent that power. 2. Opposition here can also be understood as everything that does or can have an indirect political effect in the sense already mentioned. That is, everything the post-totalitarian system feels threatened by, which in fact means everything it is threatened by. In this sense, the opposition is every attempt to live within the truth, from the greengrocer's refusal to put the slogan in his window to a freely written poem. In other words, everything in which the genuine aims of life go beyond the limits placed on them by the aims of the system. 3. More frequently, however, the opposition is usually understood, again, largely by Western journalists, as groups of people who make public their nonconformist stances and critical opinions, who make no secret of their independent thinking, and who, to a greater or lesser degree, consider themselves a political force. In this sense, the notion of an opposition, more or less, overlaps with the notion of dissent. Although, of course, there are great differences in the degree to which that label is accepted or rejected. It depends not only on the extent to which these people understand their power as a directly political force, and on whether they have ambitions to participate in actual power, but also on how each of them understands the notion of an opposition. Again, here is an example in its original declaration. Charter 77 emphasized that it was not an opposition because it had no intention of presenting an alternative political program. It sees its mission as something quite different, for it has not presented such programs. In fact, if the presenting of an alternative program defines the nature of an opposition in post-totalitarian states, then the charter cannot be considered an opposition. The Czechoslovak government, however, has considered Charter 77 as an expressly oppositional association from the very beginning and has treated it accordingly. This means that the government, and this is only natural, understands the term opposition more or less as I defined it in point 2. That is, as everything that manages to avoid total manipulation and which therefore denies the principle that the system has an absolute claim on the individual. If we accept this definition of opposition, then of course we must, along with the governments, consider the charter a genuine opposition because it represents a serious challenge to the integrity of post-totalitarian power, founded as it is on the universality of living with a lie. It is a different matter, however, when we look at the extent to which individual signatories of Charter 77 think of themselves as an opposition. My impression is that most base their understanding of the term opposition on the traditional meaning of the word as it became established in the democratic societies or in classical dictatorships. Therefore, they understand opposition, even in Czechoslovakia, as a politically defined force, which, although it does not operate on the level of actual power, and even less within the framework of certain rules respected by the government, would still not reject the opportunity to participate in actual power because it has, in a sense, an alternative political program whose proponents are prepared to accept direct political responsibility for it. Given this notion of an opposition, some Chartists, the great majority, do not see themselves in this way. Others, a minority, do, even though they fully respect the fact that there is no room within Charter 77 for oppositional activity in this sense. At the same time, however, perhaps every Chartist is familiar enough with the specific nature of conditions in the post-totalitarian system to realize that it is not only the struggle for human rights that has its own peculiar political power, but incomparably more innocent activities as well, and therefore they can be understood as an aspect of opposition. No Chartist can really object to being considered in opposition in this sense. There is another circumstance, however, that considerably complicates matters. For many decades, the power ruling society in the Soviet bloc has used the label opposition as the blackest of indictments, as synonymous with the word enemy. To brand someone a member of the opposition is tantamount to saying he or she is trying to overthrow the government and put an end to socialism, naturally, in the pay of the imperialists. There have been times when this label led straight to the gallows, and of course, this does not encourage people to apply the same label to themselves. Moreover, it is only a word, and what is actually done is more important than how it is labeled. The final reason why many reject such a term is because there is something negative about the notion of an opposition. People who so define themselves do so in relation to a prior opposition. In other words, they relate themselves specifically to the power that rules society and through it define themselves, deriving their own position from the position of the regime. For people who have simply decided to live within the truth, to say aloud what they think, to express their solidarity with their fellow citizens, to create as they want, and simply to live in harmony with their better self, it is naturally disagreeable to feel required to define their own original and positive position negatively in terms of something else, and to think of themselves primarily as people who are against something, not simply as people who are what they are. Obviously, the only way to avoid misunderstanding is to say clearly, before one starts using them, in what sense the terms opposition and member of the opposition are being used, and how they are in fact to be understood in our circumstances. And that concludes our reading for this session. See you next time.